Downsizing continues to be the operative word in the world of mainstream news media. Recently, ABC News and the BBC announced significant budget cuts. Even in the age of television, newspapers largely defined what was newsworthy and provided the foundation for American journalism. But reliance on the printed word is giving way to the digital age, with unclear implications for what will be gained and what will be lost. This week on Dialogue, from print to digital. Hello again and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guests today are Jamie Stiehm and Marvin Kalb. Jamie Stiehm is a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center, where she's working on a biography of Quaker leader Lucretia Mott. She also writes for U.S. News & World Report and Politics Daily. Previously, she was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun and The Hill. Marvin Kalb is Edward R. Murrow Professor of Practice Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. His career encompasses 30 years of award-winning reporting for CBS and NBC News as Chief Diplomatic Correspondent, Moscow Bureau Chief, and host of Meet the Press. He now hosts the Kalb Report, a discussion of media ethics and responsibility at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and he's a regular contributor to Fox Television and National Public Radio. Marvin, Jamie, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Let's start with what has changed. I think we all accept that the industry is changing in significant ways, but sometimes in a way where we're vague about it. Let's try to get into some particulars. And I'll share with you, several years ago, doing a documentary on press secretaries and interviewing all of them about what changes they saw from the position of those being covered versus those doing the covering. And Marlin Fitzwater said that the thing that changed the most was the satellite. And because what the satellite did was eliminated reflection time, eliminated preparation time, there was now an expectation that everything had to be responded to just like that. And in some ways, the internet is that on steroids. So with that in mind, if maybe you agree or disagree with Mr. Fitzwater, but also what other things you would identify that are the real change that we're talking about. Marvin, let's begin with you.
Well, first, it's the new technology, which is what Marlon was referring to. And you just take what he was referring to and take it into this new crazy world that we're in right now, where nobody quite knows the origin of a piece of information. Is that piece of information based on a reliable check by professional reporters, shot by professional cameramen, with some editor sitting back there checking it all out? Answer today is no. So we're in a world where we are the prisoner of whatever information comes our way, and it is left to us to determine whether the information is valid or not. And what happens now, at least in the U.S., is that people will go with that information that they are politically comfortable with or culturally comfortable with, without anybody saying that that information really is dead wrong.
If it feels good, they accept it.
Yeah, why not?
Now, what Marvin describes essentially is a world where everybody's a journalist, if they choose to claim that they are. I'm guessing it was different when you decided you were aspiring young journalists and you thought you were joining a more exclusive club.
I'm in mid-career right now, John, and I have seen two seismic shifts. My first job was with CBS News, which is Marvin's alma mater, and then my second, long-term job was with the Baltimore Sun. And at CBS News, we started to see all the foreign bureaus close right around 1989, 1990, when you really needed people over the Atlantic. But I saw a diminishment of CBS News, sadly, and I decided to cross the bridge to print, reliable, old, faithful print. And I love the bells and whistles of an old city newsroom, like the Baltimore Sun, the New York Times, the Boston Globe. It was a thrill to be an ink-stained wretch. And that thrill is gone as the
Remind me not to take stock advice from you. But let's talk about this whole notion of the golden age, or what was before, bureaus closing. What would you describe as a high watermark for American journalism?
Well, for me, it was the experience of working with Ed Murrow. Ed Murrow hired me in 1957. It was an extraordinary group of journalists. They were all highly experienced. They spoke foreign languages. They knew more, by the way, than many foreign ambassadors based in a country. And it was the CBS reporter in Germany to which an intelligent visitor would stop and see rather than the ambassador, because he knew more. He just did. Now, that was the time when journalism felt that it had to tell the people what the journalist thought the person ought to know, the information that they felt was important for an informed citizen to have.
And you're distinguishing that from?
From today. Because I think what is happening right now is that networks operate on the basis of, if somebody likes something, give it to them. It doesn't matter whether it's good or bad, so long as it gets ratings, it makes a lot of money. And they're in a world right now, John, which is quite different from the past. And here you sort of have to bow in their direction. I was at CBS at a time when there were 3 major networks. Today we have 3 major cable networks. And then all of the other networks around the country and the world that have legitimacy by virtue of the internet. They can get somewhere. That means that it's kind of a free-for-all. And you don't have a sense of any kind of editorial control or discipline. And I believe that journalism ought to be responsible. The journalist ought to be giving something that has been checked out, that is real, that is authentic. And my concern right now, and it's more than a concern, my nightmare is that all kinds of information go out now, simply not true, and yet the information has a huge impact on public policy. I mean, in the summer of '09, we were told by people at various town hall meetings around the country that old people like me were going to have everything, all of their health care was going to be cut off. There were death panels, everything was hard. It simply wasn't true, and yet it became part of the public dialogue. Highly responsible people were using it as if it were a fact, but it wasn't. And where were the journalists then to say, hey, cheers, time?
Where were the journalists, Jamie Stiehm? This post-truth era, as some have described it as that, in that
That's
the truth no longer matters.
Interesting phrase.
Well, we all live in an ethereal community now, and I put that in quotes. And as Marvin says, there's less and less an authoritative version of what happened yesterday. Say, the New York Times, I think, still provides one. CBS News in its heyday certainly did. But now you might say it's a more democratic, small d medium, the news media.
And some people think that's a good thing.
Yes, and I think of it as a series of lots of little snapshots without one grand portrait, like a Rembrandt, of yesterday.
It's the old story of the blind man and the elephant.
Something like that. So what we do is we all sort of disperse to different corners of the ether, and then we get affirmed in our own beliefs by other people we've never met. Mm-hmm. And then it increasingly becomes a divide between those who believe in death panels and those who know it's nonsense. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of communication over that divide.
Is the problem that corporate media just doesn't challenge those who would spread nonsense like death panels because they're afraid of alienating viewers who agree with that? Is that, I'm trying to figure out why the watchdog isn't biting when someone throws lies into the public discourse. Why aren't they challenged in an aggressive manner? The march to war in Iraq and claims about weapons of mass destruction.
That's a much more serious example. That is the example. Where was the media in 2003 when Colin Powell was up in front of the United Nations making false claims? They were falling in love with him is what happened. Even Mary McGrory thought it was such a great show and such a noble speech, and he can't be telling us anything that's not right. And the whole media, print, TV, cable, there was sort of a march to war that they all went along with and became embedded in more ways than one.
Now, where is this fact-checking on these things in a robust manner?
Well, if you go back to the war with Iraq in 2003, there was, I think we'll all agree, there was a huge sense of patriotism. The United States had been attacked, and we were attacking back, and we were retaliating. And I think that most people, journalists are not on a cloud. Journalists are real people working with real problems. They also have mortgages, and they have to figure things out. And at that time, there was not the sense that we had to go back and double-check every single thing that Colin Powell said. And we have to add, in fairness to Powell, he thought at the time he said it that he was telling you the truth. So we're at a time now when the absence of the fact-checker, the absence of the reporter who believes that it's his or her responsibility to get out there to listen to Powell and then say, geez, I wonder if that's right, and to double and triple check. That is not there anymore. There is not the time for it. There is the demand, as you started the program by saying, there is a demand now for live commentary. Don't have time to think. You don't have time to write. You just have time to say what's on your mind.
To chatter.
And your mind, to chatter.
Chatter.
And your mind may not be that good. And just because you're on television does not mean you're right. It only means you're on television.
That's right. Well, you know, this ties to what you were saying earlier about journalists giving people what they want versus what they need. So in the march up to war, and people were all feeling this sense of national pride and a need for revenge and fear, and nobody was going to rock their boat. Nobody in mainstream journalism was going to rock their boat.
That's right. And there were a couple of reporters, again, in fairness to these few, who did sound off. But so many of the journalists were on the wavelength of the administration that the few who sounded off simply were overwhelmed. Nobody heard them. Or they were put on page 17 of the Washington Post when they could have been on page 1. But again, that was not so much the fault of an individual journalist. It was the country was moving toward war. And the majority of the American people almost wanted it. The journalist, that's not the journalist's responsibility, though. The journalist has to be there somewhat detached to examine what is going on and to give the evidence backing up the story one way or the other. We're not having that now. And we're not having that because there's no requirement, there's no obligation on the part of most reporters today, and there are still first-class journalists all over. But they work in an environment that increasingly is narrow, where they have to provide information that fits into a cylinder of thought. And that is bad, and it's dangerous for democracy. And I don't want to overstate this, but I really feel that the absence of checks, balance on information is a dangerous thing, and that's what we've got.
Jimmy, what have you encountered as far as the role of the editor in your career? Have you seen this evolution where there's less editorial oversight and you're more on your own when you post to a blog or something like that?
Well, John, during my 10 years at the Baltimore Sun, I had the best of editors. And I learned how to cover the cops, how to cover a library closing, how to cover Yo-Yo Ma rehearsing with the Baltimore Symphony, a little bit of everything. And I take that with me when I left. I'm almost have to be my own editor now that I'm writing online. And I miss that give and take and that critical eye and the middle initial that they insisted you put in someone's name in an obituary. There are very high standards at the Baltimore Sun, and there are quotes from H.L. Mencken on the walls. So it was a very inspiring place to work when we were winning Pulitzer Prizes in the late 90s. But once the Baltimore Sun started closing foreign bureaus, that was like the canaries in the mine. And I left 2 years ago, but I try to keep the editors I had alive in my mind because I do not get much editing on the internet.
At the risk of being Pollyannish, let me try to talk about some positive changes. One is that there's a better feedback loop now. In the days when newspapers were dominant, letters to the editor were part of that mix, and it was effective feedback loop. When TV became the dominant medium, there wasn't very effective feedback loop. There were giant networks that did not have a way to engage with their viewers around the nation and the world. Now the internet creates this situation. I'm sure every time you post, you receive viewer comment or reader comments.
A lot of hostile ones, actually.
Well, I'm not saying it's all civil discourse, but there now is an outlet, and so even in with the lack of editors, people become editors, similarly as they've been journalists. They respond quickly to untruths or misstatements. Or
John, they would be an editor if they got it before it was published.
Yeah.
But once it is published, it's out there, and it gets back to this point about people attaching themselves to information that they like. Jamie does a first-class piece, and it appears on the web. Somebody looks at that and they say, oh my God, Jamie is a liberal, and I hate liberals. And you begin to just rip into any liberal. Right. And you go with these things, and I find that is where information is today. That's where this whole world is today of information. Where is the editor? By God, you really need that. You really need that, and we don't have him.
And where's the shoe leather?
I failed in an attempt to find something positive. Is there?
You can. There are positive things in the sense that there is more information today available to more people than ever before in the history of mankind. There's no question about that. But they have to recognize that the information is across a wide spectrum, but it's very thin. And it imposes upon the citizen an additional responsibility, if he or she wants that, to dig more deeply. So that's an individual responsibility. And people are lazy and they don't want to accept that responsibility. But it's there.
Yeah. And that information is not sifted at all. It's not placed on page one. It's not organized necessarily. And people really may not have the time to do, the selection that Marvin's talking about. That's what newspapers are for, is to see what was the most important thing that happened yesterday, and to just get a visual from looking at the front page of priorities. So what we have is, Marvin calls it information. What we have is more information with more voice, but less reporting. It's much more subjective.
Let's talk a bit more about this less reporting aspect, because I think this is critical. More information, but less people out there, as you said, the shoe leather. Actually, in the trenches, the old stereotypical Hollywood portrayal of a journalist out there asking primary sources questions.
Just the facts, ma'am.
Just the facts, ma'am. Now everybody goes in with an opinion, but where are they getting their news? They're not reporting in this traditional way. So who is informing?
This terrific point. I think, John, that the essence of the whole thing that we're talking about, all of it, goes back to somebody going out there and finding out what it is. War correspondents today, you have people who are war correspondents by virtue of the fact that they are there where a war happens to be taking place. So they become a war correspondent. They provide the information. That whole world of the blogosphere, they're not covering the war. They're covering the people who cover the war. And if the people who cover the war do not report it in a proper way, then they will be attacked.
Right.
And I think that the hardcore...
5 reporters and 5 million second guessers.
Well, all right.
That's sort of the
key. The key to it all, do you have somebody who actually goes out and talks to people, watches people, covers a war, is actually there? There are, because of the economic cutbacks, there are fewer of those, but more of all of the commentators. And so we're dependent upon less information that is then put in a Cuisinart in a way. And at the end of the day, what you have is this foam of opinion, sort of facts, factoids they call them. But that isn't journalism. I don't know where we are, by the way. I don't know if journalism can find its way back or what it is today.
Journalists always resisted any notion of licensing or professional standards that would lead to, like, the American Medical Association, because they thought it might infringe on their First Amendment rights. But I think that was a mistake in retrospect, now that anybody can just be a journalist, practice without a license.
I don't think anything could have stopped the force of, say, the Huffington Post, which changed the field completely, whether you had a degree or not. You and I have written for them.
Guilty as charged.
I think it's a tremendous phenomenon in many ways. It's created this big conversation. They publish what you write pretty much without editing it. So you have, as Marvin says, you really have to be critical when you read. But it's brought a lot of people into that conversation that wouldn't be there otherwise. That's good. But now in writing for Politics Daily, which is an online newspaper founded just a year ago, I am getting more editing there, and that I've missed it so much.
This is how bad it's gotten now. Reporters are actually asking for editing.
Yes, exactly.
But the Huffington Post, as an example, one of the things that they've done is added an investigative journalism unit through funding. You see the investigative journalism workshops at American University. We had Chuck Lewis on the program a couple weeks ago. ProPublica, you're seeing these different models emerge. So is this where there's perhaps some hope? That, and one of the things happening here, if you look at who run these various operations, they're journalists.
And they're very good journalists. And yes, there is hope. And that's why I am not in total despair. But I do feel that there are these opportunities out there to try to do something right. But, and we have to be realistic here, the money is on the other side. The large corporate interests are on the other side. We are working in an environment that sort of discourages the ProPublica concept of investigative reporting. And yet, at the Shorenstein Center up at the Kennedy School, we give out awards every year for investigative reporting. I am astonished and so deeply proud of the fact that a couple of hundred submissions come in, and they're really good. So there are, I said before and I want to repeat again, there are wonderful journalists around, but they're operating in a narrower world, and that makes it more difficult for them. But their responsibility is the same. It is to go out and get the news as best they can.
One news organization that has actually seen an uptick in its viewership. It's hard to, what you call it these days, because especially when it's web-based, is it viewership, is it readership? It's a combination. NPR. That they have shown numbers where their listeners are on the rise and visits to their website are on the rise. What I'm leading to is there a different model we should be looking at in this country to get the kind of watchdog function we need? More public broadcasting, more publicly supported broadcasting to go up against these major forces on the other side of the equation who are much better funded.
Yeah, well, in a way, you can quickly say, yes, I wish it were that way, but there is a danger that goes along with that. Because if it is government money, and if it is, to some extent, is it 20% or 80% government controlled, or the organization being dependent upon the government for money, then, you know, talk about the build-up to the war against Iraq. Where did we have that kind of a journalistic environment? Everybody would have been saying that it's absolutely terrific, let's go to war. So there's a danger there. But is there an opportunity, witness NPR, to get a little money from the government, but to do big things with it? Absolutely.
We're looking beyond our borders, a BBC-type model.
Yeah, well, the BBC is, you know, gets its money from the people. Everybody chips in.
A license fee.
You know, what is it, a license fee, $1 or $2 or $10 a year, and they're happy with that. But it, again, there is that slight danger that you simply have to be mindful of.
What are the most positive developments you see? Can we identify trends, Jamie, that you think are good news for journalism?
Yes, I can, and that is not necessarily for journalists, but for society. The fact that the Huffington Post brought so many people into the presidential election of 2008. There was so much conversation. There was so much, people were galvanized, and between 2004 and 2008, that became almost a political hurricane, that Huffington Post. And
a civic engagement hurricane.
Yes, and leaving journalists aside, I think that was healthy discourse for democracy. And there was a quote-unquote bloggers ball the night before the inauguration.
Was it virtual, or did people actually show up?
It was at the museum, as a matter of fact, and a perfect setting for it. And I almost felt like I was invited to my own funeral in a way, because bloggers had done so much to move traditional news gathering aside in those 4 years, with the culmination being, I believe, President Obama's election.
Right. Well, we haven't even the own funeral metaphor. We haven't even touched about the fact that the big problem for many is that this is a free environment. The notion is to give it away. So how do you pay a qualified reporter to do his or her thing when the environment demands that it essentially be posted free of charge?
Well, that is the big argument right now. Rupert Murdoch, in charge of the News Corporation, believes that if you charge for the news pulled together by the Wall Street Journal, his newspaper now, and you charge for that, that there will be people there who will pay for it because they recognize it's quality information.
There's a leap of faith aspect to it.
Absolutely. And so far, it's interesting that Murdoch, when he first took over the Wall Street Journal, that idea about selling your product was already in play. And the first thing he did was stop it, because he said people are not going to really buy into it. Well, now he's changed his mind. He's changed his mind. Why? I think because he realizes that if you go with the old model, the newspaper continues to go down. It's descending in importance and number. How do you bring in some money to keep it going? When you think about it, if you get a subscription to the New York Times, I don't know what you pay, but we pay about $600-700 a year. Okay. Let's say the New York Times said, we no longer will give you a newspaper, but we'll put it out on the web. Would you pay us $700 a year? If your answer is yes, then maybe the demise of many newspapers is not that bad, if people will pay that $700.
A quick final thought. We only have about 30 seconds left.
I sometimes think of newspapers like the Symphony. When you go to the Symphony, there are a lot of people who are older than me and not many who are younger than me. And you wonder if just the palpable pleasure of holding a newspaper in your hands, reading it, is going to vanish. And Marvin posed the question, would you pay for it online? That's the question. Arianna Huffington says no.
Right. You have to figure out another way. She had that debate here in town with Rupert Murdoch. I can accept getting rid of paper. I'm more concerned about how that changes the content that goes into the words that you read off of your screen. I wish we had more time. We've touched we've scraped the surface. There's so much more to discuss. Thanks. Maybe we can have you back again sometime.
Thank you.
You bet.
To those of you watching on MHZ or listening on radio, we appreciate your comments and encourage you to share them with us, that old feedback loop we were talking about. And you can do so by sending email to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, on behalf of the Dialogue production team and all the staff at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.
Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.